Welcome to Policy Chats, the official podcast of the School of Public Policy at the University of California, Riverside. I'm your host, Rachel Strassman. Join me and my classmates as we learn about potential policy solutions for today's biggest societal challenges. Climate change is real, and it is most definitely here. Yet it is such a large, nuanced issue to tackle, and in this world where so many different policy areas overlap and intersect with each other, it is so valuable to have an interdisciplinary approach to the issues we tackle and evaluate, which is why we are so grateful to have with us today Osprey Orielle Lake, the founder and executive director of the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, author of The Story is in Our Bones, How Worldviews and Climate Justice Can Remake a World in Crisis and Uprisings for the Earth, and a world-renowned international climate justice advocate. Her career's worth of experience advocating for climate justice, women's leadership, and overall a sustainable, inclusive, clean energy future is nothing short of inspiring, which is why we are so grateful to have her here with us today to speak on Policy Chats. With that, thank you so much for joining, Executive Director Orielle Lake. Getting right into it, can you please take a moment to briefly describe your background and what led you to where you are here today, and what inspired you to pursue a career in international advocacy and climate action?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on your podcast. And I really love the theme of this podcast and think it's so important right now. It's a critical time for all of us to become more and more educated and understand the systems that we live within and policy and advocacy components of the governance structures that we are subjected to and need to participate in both. And so, to get to your question, I think like a lot of people, in my youth, I was very close with nature. Nature has always been really important to me, especially because more and more of us are living in urban environments. And so I think there's a lot of need to connect with the natural world. And so that really began my career because where I grew up in Mendocino, which is a small town in Northern California, I was very fortunate to be amongst the old redwood tree forests there, the old growth forests. But at the same time, there were many areas that were being clear cut and logged. And it began at a very young age for me to think about how are we living with each other and the land that this level of destruction is going on with these beautiful forests who are shrinking, just at such an alarming rate. And so, things like that, I think, started, forming my career. And then fast forward to, more recently with the founding of the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, or WECAN, that really began actually during the Obama administration when I was watching with a lot of people this hope that we were going to see a lot of change in the climate negotiations that governments are doing on an annual basis. And we didn't really see the results that were necessary to meet the scale and scope of the crisis at hand. And it was after that UN climate talk that year, which was in Copenhagen, that I decided to stop everything I was doing. And I started doing all of this research on, the entry point that I wanted to take around the climate movement and working to stop the worst impacts of the climate crisis. And I found that there was this amazing amount of research around the role of women's leadership that was being underreported, unacknowledged, underfunded, and was absolutely necessary to sustainability and a more just and healthy future going forward. And so I've put all my time and energy into this work to really lift up the role of women all over the world in their work around climate justice and leadership. And we can talk more about that as we go on, but that's how I sort of got started on this work.
Thank you so much for that answer. And I think how your discussion on how it all started with the beautiful redwood trees highlights such an important thing with climate justice, that advocating for these climate justice policies doesn't just benefit the earth, it benefits the people as well. And we previously had a podcast guest, UCR researcher, Dr. Francesca Hopkins, who said that, making a walkable city not only benefits the climate, but it benefits the people living in this world. It's going to benefit their mental health, seeing all the trees that are providing them with shade in their cities, making them feel happier. and it's also going to do something good for the earth. So it's great to hear that that's kind of how it started for you as well. Kind of shifting gears a little bit, kind of as you discussed, intersectionality plays a large role in the work you do, whether it be shifting the narrative on climate change, as you said, using a feminist lens, or through your work on preserving cultural diversity as it relates to climate action. How does this translate into policy and policy implementation?
It's a great question, and I spent a lot of the book that you mentioned, The Story is in Our Bones, How Worldviews and Climate Justice Can Remake a World in Crisis, on this topic of intersectionality, because really when we start tugging on one system, we start realizing that these interconnected systems of oppression that have produced the climate crisis, have produced environmental degradation, are completely connected to environmental racism, and to colonization, and to patriarchal institutions, and to capitalism and extractive industries. So I think it's really important when we begin to address climate justice that we immediately are talking about an intersectional lens. And this is very essential because for too long, as an example, the environmental movement has been very siloed, or the women's movement, and the labor movement, and all these different movements, which are essential, and we pour our heart and souls into the efforts of this work that we do with communities, not here in the United States only, but all over the world. And we need to continue that work, but we're at such a moment that many scholars are calling a polycrisis, where we're seeing, there are issues around the environment, around race, around economy, around policy. All of these things are intersecting at this point. That we really need to have a holistic view of policy, a holistic view of programming, a holistic view of governance. And this needs to be sort of the DNA of which we perform our activities wherever we're entering the climate movement. And so this is something that I really advocate for. And just as one example, it's so critical when we're talking about gender equity that we have a racial lens, because it's very different for Indigenous, Black and Brown and Asian women to advocate within the environmental space, because it needs to be taken into account that not only are they being impacted by patriarchal institutions and how that's impacting their bodies in terms of like the fossil fuel industry, or their ability to function in crises, and the many different ways that gender inequality impacts women in crises. But on top of that, there's also a racial lens and the issues around racism that also impact women of color. And so I think we always need to put those things together. And again, that is something that an intersectional lens and framework really makes space for. And I think it's critical that we do that, because it's the only way we can ensure all of our communities are cared for, and that we're really moving towards egalitarian societies in every aspect, which can address, just to be very explicit about these systems of oppression of colonization, racism, patriarchy, and capitalism, or different forms of extractive industries, and how those different systems all work together to oppress people and continue to perpetuate white supremacy and the wealthy elite. And we need to really begin to dismantle and transform those systems. And the only way I think we can do that is through intersectional movement building.
Thank you so much. And kind of branching off of that a bit, how do you find a balance with intersectionality and trying to unify all of these related areas with still making sure to highlight the individualistic and unique voices and experiences that all of these different types of people and groups of people experience when it comes to climate justice?
So I think one of the things that we can be really aware of is that while we can work in coalitions that are cross-sector, it's essential that within that process, as I think you're suggesting, that we don't lose the individual struggles that are very unique. The work of anti-Black racism is very different than the work of decolonization. They're completely related in the sense of discrimination and marginalization and invisibilization. But the experience of those different populations are different in their histories and the impacts and the ways in which they're being discriminated against. And so I think it's really important that we have disaggregated data, and that we really look at those individuals and their stories and their histories. And all of those things have to be taken account for there to be, proper reparations, or there to be true justice and remedy for the harms that have happened to frontline communities, as an example. And on the other side of that, the solutions that they're offering, because I also find it to be not just about, the remedy for harms or reparations for harms due to these systems of oppression that we're talking about and how we're building our movements, but also the extraordinary leadership that is coming out of frontline communities because of all that they have experienced. And so I think we need to think about, the individual efforts and solutions that come out of different populations, and how we need to respect all of them and understand the different roles. So yeah, I think it's a matter of working collectively while also understanding the unique heritage, relationships, histories, and knowledge bases that each community is coming from.
Thank you so much for that response. That was very beautifully worded. Kind of moving towards more of the policy side now, are there any particular climate justice policies or frameworks that are central to your international advocacy, and how are they being implemented?
Great question. So, first of all, being a women's organization, you can imagine that we really are working from a feminist lens and feminist policies, whether they're feminist foreign policies, or as an example, every year we go to the United Nations climate talks, and we're in coalition with the Women and Gender constituency, which is one of the constituencies that are advocating and engaged in the negotiations with governments. So yes, there's a feminist lens, and how do we have gender equity at the core of the policy work that we do, and how do we have gender responsive climate policies, as an example. And so I think this is cross-cutting, how do we have gender equity and gender equality across all policy frameworks? So that's very important to us. And I just want to mention one thing, because sometimes we can skip over the fact that ethically and morally we understand that there should be egalitarian societies, and women and men should be equally in charge of governance. And also to say that I wouldn't want to just leave it at gender binaries. There's also gender diverse people across the gender spectrum that are ignored. So how do we have gender equity in these spaces, of course, is first and foremost. But I also wanted to state that beyond the moral factor, just to give some of your listeners some stats to think about. As one example, from countries around the world, there's something called the Women's Political Empowerment Index, which is basically, is there equity in any particular country for women, and what is their economy? What is their agency in any country? What is their political empowerment in that country? So it's called the Women's Political Empowerment Index. And with just a 1-unit increase in that index, research shows that there's an 11.51% decrease in carbon emissions reduction. So this is huge, to find anything that will get you over 10% of something that will reduce carbon emissions. And by this empowerment of women, just by 1 unit, we see this result. 40 to 80% of all household food productions in developing countries, which is core to adaptation and mitigation of the climate crisis, is done by women. And I could go on, and I would just suggest, if people are interested, to go to our website, where we have, an entire, page dedicated to statistics and stories about why women's role is so essential right now. But I think it's important to understand that this is morally and ethically correct, but also technically speaking, factually speaking, we can't get to the world we want without women being at the forefront. So I just wanted to actually just add in a little bit of evidence for that, because I think it's important to realize that this is something we must address. And then going back to your question of the different policies, beyond the feminist analysis I was just mentioning, and why it's so critical. I think I'll mention 2 that I think are also important, which is one, the rights of nature movement. This is something we've been very engaged in for a long time. I sit on the executive committee of something called the Global Alliance for Rights of Nature. And it's this idea that we need to really, both in terms of how we structure our legal frameworks around the environment, but also our economic frameworks, that we keep putting nature in the marketplace. So we see the commodification and financialization of nature and nature as property. And that has been such a detrimental move in the human experiment of governance, if you will. And so what we see is a lot of regulatory environmental laws where we try to regulate how much harm will come to this forest, how much harm will come to this river as industries continue to exploit and grow and continue to extract. And they regulate harm, but they don't really stop it. And as we know, many times industry is very engaged in regulating themselves, so that becomes even more difficult of a way to protect the environment. And so with rights of nature, it's really turning environmental laws upside down and inside out and saying, no, nature, Mother Earth, planetary boundaries need to be at the center of the discussion, and that rivers have rights, forests have rights. And instead of being the property of humans to be used and unfortunately abused a lot, how do we ensure that rivers have rights to thrive and grow and be healthy? Forests have the right on their own, with their own standing, to be healthy and grow. So it's a long body of work under the framework of Earth jurisprudence. And Christopher Stone might be a scholar some of your listeners might be interested in looking up, who wrote a paper called "Do Trees Have Standing?" back in the 70s. And so this work has been going on for a while, but it's quite a substantial movement at this point, and not just an idea, but being put into practice. So as an example, in 2008, Ecuador became the first country in the world to put rights of nature to their constitution. And since then, several rivers have been protected using rights of nature laws, saying, no, this river has the right to thrive and flourish and be healthy and not subjected to human pollution, as an example. And across the United States, there's over 13 dozen local ordinances in communities where people have enacted rights of nature legislations to stop fracking in their community or some other harm. And right now, there's over 39 countries around the world who are working with rights of nature legislation. So it's an idea whose time has come, and we just need to have this flourish more. And of course, there's many obstacles to it because naturally, industry is completely uninterested in this kind of legislation and governance because it means that some of their activities would immediately halt. But we really need to continue to look at enforcing rights of nature and implementing it in many other countries and in our communities, because we must stop the way that we've been treating the earth. It clearly is not working. I don't need to explain the fact of the climate crisis escalating madly every year, and environmental degradation and species extinction and on and on and on, the pollution to the oceans and waters. I mean, we radically need to change our relationship with nature. And I think rights of nature is a very powerful initiative and code of conduct and legal framework that could really impact not only environmental laws, but also the way we frame our economy to have nature be above our economic decisions. So I'll leave it at that. There's a lot on the internet and on our website about that. And I'll just mention one other policy initiative that I think is really powerful that we're also engaged in, called the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which I sit on the steering committee of. And this is a very powerful initiative in that while it is very important, many of us all over the world really fought for the Paris Climate Agreement that happened in 2015, which was, very important that all governments agreed to a structure to combat the climate crisis. And through a lot of work, we were able to establish with vulnerable countries inside the negotiations and civil society movements, gaining as an example, the 1.5-degree guardrail, which we're really depending upon for our advocacy work to hold governments and financial institutions accountable to that guardrail. However, most of the Paris Climate Agreement deals with carbon emission reductions. And this leads to a lot of what we call false solutions and technologies that don't even exist yet, while governments and the fossil fuel industry and business continues as usual. So at this point, we're looking at a 2.5 to 3 degree rise in global temperatures with the plan we're on right now. So what the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty does is it's like a parallel mechanism that was started by a wonderful woman named Zipporah Berman, who is the chair of this treaty. And the idea is to create a mechanism for governments to explicitly gather together and create a mechanism and a process to get off of fossil fuels, because we're not going to solve the climate crisis by having a shell game and moving things around and having false carbon offsets and kicking the can down the road. We have to deal with gas, oil, and coal and stopping the extraction of fossil fuels. And so we need a mechanism to do that. And this treaty is gaining momentum. Over, I think now 13 countries have signed on, endorsed the treaty. And, we work all year long to get more and more endorsers. So it's another policy piece I'm really interested in. So there's so many, but I'll just leave it at that.
Truth, accuracy, fairness, curiosity. These are the pillars of journalism and of higher education. At the Wall Street Journal, we pride ourselves on being a trusted and essential resource. The Wall Street Journal is partnered with the University of California, Riverside to provide your campus an unparalleled access to essentials to be prepared academically, professionally, and personally. Students get full access to WSJ News, curated newsletters, challenges, podcasts, and documentary series to help stay up to date. Activate your school-sponsored subscription today at wsj.com/UC Riverside.
Thank you so much. And you've kind of touched on this economy where the rights of nature is at its center. So kind of talking about that for a moment, in a world where, as you explained, industry plays such a large role in the regulation of itself, and in a world where it's not just about the science or creating these new ideas for how to resolve climate change, but it's about actually getting countries and governments and organizations and businesses to do it. How can this new economy be framed and accomplished?
It's one of the biggest questions of our time, and I'll roll out a few comments here. I spent a lot of time in my book on this because it's so huge, in the sense that, we live in these endless economic growth systems, and they're directly at odds with protecting the earth, because it means we continuously are extracting more and more from the earth and do not have a system of reciprocal relationships, a reciprocal economy, a circular economy, or many of these other models that are coming up that I think are really valuable. And the transition to this extractive economy, which has been going on for a long, long time, based on capitalism, but also other forms of economies, will perpetuate, harms to communities and harms to the earth. And how to get out of that is one of the biggest questions of our time. And it's not that we don't have other models. As an example, we see in Bhutan, they have the gross national happiness indicator instead of GDP. Like, what makes people happy? And let's take indicators about how well nature's doing in a country, how happy people are, how educated they are, versus how much money everyone's making. And so, how do we have these other indicators that are not just based on GDP? And then, we have some other models like beyond growth or degrowth. There's these beautiful movements coming out of the global south, which I also mentioned in my book, around things like sumak kausai, which is this idea of living well. And how do we have a holistic view of our economy that includes how well the environment is doing, that includes other levels of exchange, that values other things. So as an example, valuing going out to dinner with your friends, or cooking a meal, or growing a garden, valuing that up. What other kinds of ways can we grow and learn creatively that aren't based on endless economic material growth? It's a huge mindset shift, but we have to start, in my opinion, getting engaged in that, because right now we have over-consumerism. We have everybody looking at their quarterly gains, and we're on this rat race that is so dangerous to our communities and the planet. And so it's not that we don't have some models about how to get off the system, but we have a power struggle with the wealthy elite, and having that transition, I think, is one of the biggest struggles that we have. How to convince, the fossil fuel industry, how to convince mining companies or logging companies that they need to change their model. They need to transition off of those extractive industries is a very big task, but we need to engage in it. We need to invite that conversation. We need to have what many are calling a just transition, which is looking at how workers who are, let's say, in the fossil fuel industry, how we're going to transition them into renewable energy jobs. So it's not about people losing out, but how can we create enough win for people who are in dangerous extractive industries to get new jobs in other industries? And then it's also not about just the jobs. It's also about thinking, as an example, where everyone's very excited about the fact that we can move into solar and wind and renewable energy technologies, which obviously we need to do and get off of fossil fuels. But how do we do that is a question. And this is why this economy question, the just transition framework is so key, because as an example, so many Indigenous communities that we work with are harmed by the extraction of fossil fuels. But if we suddenly decide we need all of these trace minerals and transition minerals to build all of the batteries and all the things we need for the renewable energy revolution, those same communities are going to now be ruined and extracted and the rivers destroyed and their lands destroyed through mining. And so it can't be the same model that we just are trying to move off of extraction and harm to frontline communities, and only the wealthy elite or the global north countries winning in this scenario. So how do we approach this with equity and justice and health for everyone at the center of the conversation is a very different model. And I'll just leave it at also a scholar who I really love is Jason Hickel, who's an economist. And he was engaged in a wonderful debate with another academic. I'm sorry, I can't think of the person's name he was debating, but it's online on YouTube. And it's really fascinating because they have a debate about the difference between the green economy and degrowth. And I think it's an essential argument that we need to look at, because the green economy is basically, we can continue to have everybody grow and make money, and somehow that will get us out of the climate crisis. Or we need to start looking at degrowth and shifting how we're thinking and bring in a climate justice framework. And again, I think it's tricky to have just binaries, but I do think that this debate and looking at these two different views on the economy is really key, and something that we're really struggling with as a global community.
Thank you. And highlighting all of these different perspectives and questions that need to be answered are very important in creating a truly comprehensive and effective policy when it comes to climate change. So thank you so much for speaking on that. Kind of along the same note, there are a lot of discussions, and I know you've mentioned this as well, on a decentralized, democratized, clean energy future, which is very important to the climate justice movement. So can you please elaborate on what that means and why it is important?
So very much along the lines of sort of what I was suggesting before is, how do we actually move off of fossil fuels into clean energy in a way that doesn't create more harms or injustices to, let's say, Indigenous territories or frontline communities where there's just more extraction and poison and pollution in their communities through the transition in our energy system. And so that's one component of it. Another component of it is also looking at how do we decentralize this energy and democratize it, meaning the wind is outside, the sun is in the sky. We should really be able to get away from these energy monopolies and these big industries and be able to, in our own communities, control and have our own power, our power to have our own power. And I think this is really a new model that many people have been discussing, and some communities are already practicing, where communities are generating their own solar power and putting up their own solar units and collectively using them in their own communities. So I think that a big part of this energy transition is how we even view decentralizing the power grid and how we also give power back to people. And of course, once again, we're up against industry who won't financially benefit from this decentralized, democratized energy model. But I think this is the direction that we need to go. And this is part of climate justice and the just transition.
And this thing you talk about giving people back that ability to have that power, I think we talk a lot on the podcast about how policies can have adverse consequences, but not enough on how policies can have these ripple effects where it's not just that they're benefiting climate and they're benefiting people by giving them access to power, but they're also giving them a choice and a say in what they're doing with that. So kind of talking more about the way society is framed right now in a world where we're seeing unprecedented energy usage from emerging technologies such as AI and a huge culture of consumerism, especially perpetuated by the ability to, within the click of a button, purchase things online. And also still somehow a substantial amount of misinformation regarding climate change. What role does combating this misinformation and simultaneously educating the public play in advancing these policy goals?
Oh, that's a lot of questions in one question. Let me see if I can. Well, one thing you made me think of when you were talking is, I think one of the things that we need to do, I'm not anti-technology at all. I think it's a matter of how we use it. It's like all of these things, they can be very useful tools. It's all a matter of balance and how we're using them and the intent behind them. And, frankly, I'm very glad we have modern science, so I can go get my dentistry done in a good way that's not painful and professionally done. So, I'm not against, the development of our society and the technologies that we have. But, we have to be very responsible for them. And this brings me back to something that's really core that I wanted to sort of get at is one of the reasons in my book I talk about worldviews is that what we're thinking as human beings, our worldview, how we understand the world, what is valued, turns out to be super important. So that when we're talking about AI or we're talking about any of these technologies or we're talking about what we're consuming, we're talking about policy, we have to remember individuals are steering that and driving the direction of all of those things. And so one of the things that I became interested in writing my book and in the work I do at WECAN is this daily work we do every day at WECAN, which can be anything from, meeting with financial institutions to get them to divest from a very harmful project, to reforesting damaged land, to stopping deforestation in an area, going to the UN climate talks and working on policy, all these immediate things, rolling up our sleeves and engaging and working for transformation and change. That's what I do every day. But I also think it's important simultaneously, not in substitution of, but simultaneously to go upstream and look at how did we get into these crises and what are the root causes? Otherwise, we're just going to perpetuate the same ideologies and harms. So as an example, if tomorrow I could wave a magical wand and end the climate crisis, which I would love to be able to do. But let's say I even could do that. It wouldn't stop environmental racism. It wouldn't stop species extinction. It wouldn't stop overconsumerism. It wouldn't really change everything because it's not really dealing with how we got here, the thoughts and systems and governance structures that we have that got us into this crisis. And so this is why this upstream conversation is so important, so that we can look at things like the worldview of having dominion over nature, the idea of supremacy, that some people are more important than other people, or that we have the right to, property over nature and have nature almost be like our slave to give us everything we need without any reciprocation or care. The idea that men are more important than women or gender diverse peoples. And so we have to start looking at how we're going to compost and transform these ideas of supremacy, these ideas of dominion over nature, because they dig into so much of our policy and our social media and all the technologies that we have. They dictate how we are operating the world. And so I want us to also take time to look at our worldviews so that we can begin to unpack them, understand them, and heal them and balance them. It's sort of like if you go to the doctor and you want to get healed, they don't just start giving you things. They have to do a deep diagnosis to know what they're treating. And so this is what I'm getting at. So like as an example, how do we unpack having this, this colonized view of dominion over nature, or the right to Indigenous people's land, or, to have, environmental racism as something that's a norm instead of something we should all be outraged about and change. So I think this is also part of it. And within the question that you asked, I think one of the things we need to do is reclaim ourselves in the earth lineage and remember that we are part and particle of the web of life, that actually this reclamation and reconnection with nature and not being orphaned from the living earth, whether we live in the city or we live in the country, we're part of this incredible ecosystem of life. And if we forget that and we don't work on that on a daily basis, it deeply impacts policy and our relationship with each other, our relationship with our communities and the land, and how we're doing anything and operating our businesses or looking at AI. So for me, it's a lot about coming back to the root of the fact that we're human beings on this planet that we share, and not having that sort of be a soft issue, but actually part and central to our politics right now, to reclaim our earth lineage and to see the earth as alive and not as dead matter, that the forests, the mountains, the stones, the rivers are all alive, and we are fortunate to be a part of this incredible web of life. And how do we bring that into our politics, into our policy decisions, and into our understanding about how we're interacting with earth, so that we don't overconsume and we don't fill ourselves up with this false sense of nurturing ourselves that has been so detrimental, instead of being nurtured by friendships and the earth and the forests and walking and all these things that often get thrown to the wayside as people overconsume and look at social media and forget that we're part of this incredible web of life that can feed and nourish us in so many ways. And this is what I think is critical also to the discourse at this time.
Thank you so much for your response. I think to take a step back a little bit, we've had this great discussion so far on the intricacies of climate justice and a lot of the issues that surround it, and a lot of the great big ideas of what we can do to begin to resolve it. But looking more at the individual level, what role can an individual person play? Because wouldn't it be surprising if someone were to feel like climate change is such a daunting issue to tackle as one individual person? And having these discussions as a first step is most definitely important. But what are some things that individuals can do to help influence climate justice and policy?
Absolutely, because that's where it all begins, is how are we all engaged? I love the phrase that hope is a verb with its sleeve rolled up. And I really think that that's how we get our hope, is by rolling up our sleeves and engaging. And I think, podcasts like this are great in other ways to first get a grasp of, what is the landscape? What is going on? It's kind of scoping out, what is this issue of climate justice? What is it? What are the definitions? And becoming educated about intersectionality and intersectional movement building, and sort of doing a scoping analysis and finding out, where do you, where does anyone fit into this landscape? What is interesting for us? And I really feel like it's important that people are aligned. You hear people say this, but it's really true, with what they're passionate about. So I think it's sort of like looking at the landscape of the work, whether it's through groups in your community or at your university, or things that you find online, and finding something within the climate justice movement that really makes you feel excited, because our passion is going to really guide us a lot and give us energy to endure all the struggles, and as well as the highs and lows of the journey of participation. And so I think that's the first place to begin, is, finding out what part of the climate justice movement people feel passionate about and beginning to work in community. I think it's extremely difficult to work on one's own. I never encourage that, to be isolated and alone and try to figure this out. I think it's just too much and too overwhelming for any of us. But I think finding out what you're interested in and then finding a group that has those same alignments that you feel passionate about, and engaging, and then learning as you go. We all need to start, at the beginning. When I started WECAN, it was very, very small. We did a lot of local work, which I really, really still love so much. And it's a process. You learn as you go. You don't have to take it all on at one time. You go along and you work with others and you develop strategies. And I think that's something we can all share with each other, is, our learning and how we developed. But I think the most important thing is to get engaged. Being on the sidelines at this point, I think, is the hardest, because one, we need everybody engaged at this point given the escalation of a lot of these polycrises. And there's just so much to do and so many entry points that there's always something that can excite you to engage with. So yeah, that is what I think is most important, is to find the area that you love and jump in.
Thank you. And I think you speak to something that we think about a lot in policy, that the beauty of policy is that it exists in many levels. So you can make a difference in local policy. You don't have to take a big giant step all the way into changing the laws of the government of your country or of the international community. But your comment on hope, which I love the way you worded it about hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. I was watching one of your talks at a UN conference, I believe, and you said something similar, that true hope is built on honesty and action. And kind of on this discussion of, getting in, finding those things that you're interested in and pursuing those, how have you been able to, in your lifelong career, advocating for climate justice, stay motivated and stay persistent in your pursuit of all of these like very, very important and necessary issues?
One of the things that really excites me is the incredible women leaders that I work with every day. I'm telling you, this network is incredible. Women leading reforestation efforts and protection of the Amazon rainforest in Ecuador and Brazil, even though they're being threatened by developers or, the different institutions. I mean, they are so brave and courageous and do it with song and dance and always, very high spirit in protection of their lands. I'm thinking of Jackie Patterson, who's the executive director of the Chisholm Legacy Project here in the United States, lifting up incredible women leaders in the Black community and how they're bringing local solar energy to their communities and food security projects. I think about Nima Namandamu, who is our WECAN coordinator in the Democratic Republic of Congo, who I've been working with for about 9 years now. And we have developed this program where we're reforesting severely damaged lands and protecting over 1.6 million acres of old growth forests. It's all led by women. We've planted about 500 million trees at this point, and 500,000 trees. Sorry, I wish we had maybe we're going to plant 500 million trees.
Wishful thinking.
Yes, 500,000 trees, and it's so exciting to see how the land is recovering, how the women are being empowered through this reforestation project, to these incredible leaders we bring every year to the UN climate talks to fight for their communities and speak for themselves to governments. So every day I'm around these, certainly very hard stories and struggles, but also victories and incredible leadership and courage and boldness and, food being grown, forests being grown. And yeah, I think it's just so inspiring to see what is going on. And that really gives me so much hope while we're in this enormously daunting situation, to be sure.
And that's so great to hear that there are so many amazing individuals that are working towards these tough problems with tough solutions. And speaking of, to kind of wrap this up and get into our final question, climate change is this vast issue that we've been discussing, but we kind of ask this question to most of our guests. If you were to tomorrow be able to make one policy to take one more step closer to tackling the climate crisis in an ideal world where you do have your magic wand, what would that look like?
I love that question, and I am going to make it a little bit broader with your permission, which is,
of course,
what I would love to see is, I would love to see these policies put into place, because I think they're the most important right now. I'm sure there's others, but the ones that are coming to mind right now is rights of nature, which I mentioned before, the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. I think those would bring us very far along if governments really were to embrace that, those policies. I would also, of course, strongly recommend a feminist economy. If our approach to the economy really highlighted, the feminist analysis, that would be tremendous, because it involves the care economy and decarbonizing our economy and cares for all communities. And very importantly, we didn't talk about this a lot, but I wanted to bring it up in the last minute here, which is Indigenous rights. A big core part of our work, our WECAN, is the advocacy for Indigenous rights, because I think we need to remember that 80% of all the biodiversity left on Earth is stewarded by Indigenous peoples, whether that's in their territories or in lands that they manage, our forests, our water, our mountains. And I think it's really critical that we understand that Indigenous rights are a climate solution, and the role that Indigenous people play in terms of teaching us about caring for the earth and living in harmony with nature, our understanding of traditional ecological knowledge, the fact that it is our collective responsibility, in my opinion, to fight for Indigenous rights, including free, prior, and informed consent, that we listen to Indigenous peoples when they don't want projects coming onto their lands, which is something that's violated all of the time. So I would sort of weave these four components together of rights of nature, Indigenous rights, feminist economic policies, and the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. I think that would get us very far down the road in the direction that I would love to see.
That's amazing. Hopefully, we can see that come together sometime in the future. And with that, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been such an honor to have this discussion with you about climate justice and intersectionality and the effects of women in leadership and changing our frameworks to center on the rights of nature and highlight these parallel mechanisms. And I think discussions with people like you give us this hope that although changing policy can be difficult and can be a large issue to tackle, it is definitely something that is attainable in our future and in this future that we can make sustainable. So with that, thank you so much for joining us today, Osprey Orielle Lake. We really appreciate you.
Thank you so much. It was a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
This podcast is a production of the UC Riverside School of Public Policy, and our theme music was produced by Veer Sinha. For the latest updates on the School of Public Policy, be sure to check us out at UCR_SPP on Instagram, or for more episodes and content, visit our YouTube channel. I'm Rachel Strassman. Till next time.